Okay, I'll remove any items we didn't do. Okay, so we've built most of our back end. We've got our API running. So we could actually write one more API method before we start with the Angular front end. How would we, so this is our get all. We also want to get a single task. So what would that method look like? It'd be another get method. And it would be similar to the get method we wrote. What changes would we have to make? I think we'd have to make 1, 2, 3. I think that's it. We could maybe make 3 changes so that this could get a single task object, single task document rather than a whole collection. What things would we have to change from the method we have? Yeah. Okay, so we would change find to find by ID. Yep, that's one change. 2 other things we'd have to change. Yeah, I'd probably rename the data, the resulting object to a single one. Right. If we're going to call find by ID, we're going to need to pass the ID. So where does the ID come from? So that's the second change. And where does that ID going to come from? Not from the session. It is going to come from the request. But how would we provide a parameter to this so we know which task, Brady? Yeah, so in the URL, we would need an optional parameter here, an ID parameter. And then we'd call find by ID and we'd pass it in. Yep, we can do that as well. So at our root, we now have a parameter which I'll call underscore ID, colon indicates it's a parameter. Instead of returning all, we're just going to look up this one. So we'll use our task model, and it's got, we could use find one, or we could use find by ID. And we just pass it req.params underscore ID. So it'll grab the value, the ID value in the URL. The rest of the method's pretty much the same. So we'll get back either an error or a single task object. So then we can handle the response in exactly the same way. If we get an error, we'll return the error. It's 400. Or we'll just return that one task as a JSON object. It doesn't necessarily, it's not necessarily an HTTP error, so no. You could check, so for example, if you wanted to first query and find the object, if the object wasn't found, you could set 404, you could set 404, for example, but you would have to cascade through the logic. It's not on. Yeah, but it's not necessarily an HTTP error. It might be a database connection. Maybe it can't connect to the database. Well, we'll put in an invalid ID and we can inspect what we get back. Okay, so how could we try this? Well, let's try first and see if it works. What would be the easy way to test this? We could actually test it right from here. It's pretty simple. What could we do to call that method? There's no method name, it's just at the root. Well, I just grab an ID and throw it on the end. We don't need the colons on the server side. It represents it to parameter. So if we throw in a valid ID, it now just gives us that single object. If we change the ID, right? So here's our error. It sends it as JSON. It's not going to be a page because there's no front end. It's just going to send this back to whatever calls it. Yep. So, for example, if the error is cast, we might send 400. If it is the right type, it matches the Mongo object ID algorithm, but it's not found, we could check for that object first, then return 404. So you gave us a properly formatted object ID, but we don't have that object. So you could handle those errors in here if you wanted to be more specific about what the error was. But it won't necessarily be completely dynamic. I think you're still going to have to handle the different possibilities. Yeah. So eventually, we'll kind of leave our server for now. Our server's done for now. Eventually, we're going to need methods for add, edit, and delete. But we'll work with this for today. We'll now work on the Angular component and try and get the Angular piece to talk to our API. And if we can display data in our app, then we can deal with add, edit, and delete probably next week. So we actually are going to need 2 command prompts for this. Because I got to leave my server running, but now I need another command prompt to create the Angular app inside here. So I'll go to my terminal, and we're going to use the Angular CLI to build our new Angular app, but we want to do it in here. So make sure you're in the root folder here, or if you're already using this terminal, open a second command prompt through your operating system. So make sure you're in the root, and we want to run ng for Angular. ng new. I want to create a new Angular app called client. So this will create a folder called client and build that Angular template inside it. I'm going to get a couple of prompts when I do this. It's going to ask me 2 questions. Do we want Angular routing? I think last week we said no, and if we just hit enter, it's no. We want to say yes to this. So make sure you type Y. Yes for Angular routing. And for CSS, we can just hit enter. We're just going to use vanilla CSS. The routing is going to be important because we need our Angular component, our Angular service, to be able to use HTTP to call our server API. Without angular routing, it's not going to be able to do that. These two layers won't be able to talk to each other if we don't enable angular routing. We didn't need it for what we did last week, but we do need it this week because it's going to make HTTP calls. John? NG new client. Right here. Create a new Angular app in a new folder. Nick? If NG is not recognized, then you need to install globally the @angular/CLI. We installed it last week. So you do npmi @angular/CLI-G. CLI, command line interface. Let me know if you still have an issue. So now we get a client folder with all the Angular stuff we scaffolded last week, an exact copy, but it's running inside. So now I want to launch, so it's still running. Once it launches, I'm going to enter my client directory and we'll launch the Angular app as well. And it tells us we don't need to initialize Git because you probably didn't, but because I've already initialized Git, so Git's already, this step gets skipped. So now I need to go inside my client folder and install the Angular dependencies. I'll run the command, cd client. And now I'm inside my client, I'll just run npm I, install all the dependencies that Angular wants. We're actually going to need a third command prompt in a bit, because we need one to run the server, we need one to run the Angular client, and those command prompts are going to be locked. The servers are running, so we can't run any other commands. And we're going to need to run some other Angular commands. So now if I run start, our Angular app should start running on port 4200. Or you can run the command ng-serve, does the same thing, starts the Angular server. Yeah, so you got to run npm install in the client folder first. So do cd client and then npm I. So it says we're running. So now we've got both our server and our client running. But the Angular app is contained inside of the Node app. So right now there's no connection between the two. It's as if this was independent. We've got an Angular HTML app on the front end, and we have a separate Node app on the back end. Nothing is connected. So now I'm going to need my third prompt. So what we want to do, if we actually look at what Angular is telling us here, is we're actually going to want to run this command. We could generate a component. We want to generate a task component. So again, we want to start working on, we're going to work, we've got this stuff in red is basically done. We want to generate the component. We could do it manually, but if we use the command line, if we use that ng generate component, it will also generate a task HTML page with a CSS file. So it will scaffold some stuff for us. And then we'll need to scaffold a service that kind of lets all the pieces start to talk together. So we're going to generate a task component, and then we get this default component that we worked with last week called app component, and that's what shows up in the Angular homepage. Right, so if we look at what's happening here so far, I'll just close this up. If we go into source and app, so here's our index.html, here's our homepage, and it's using this app root tag. We saw this last week, and the app root is loading our app component, because here's the selector, and our component loads this page, this app component.html, which has like 700 lines of boilerplate code. So last week we changed this page. We're gonna leave this page alone. We're actually gonna build our own component. And then on index, instead of loading the app component, we wanna load our task component. So that way our home page is no longer gonna show this, it's gonna show basically the page we're gonna build from scratch. So we're gonna leave this here, we're basically removing the link to it. So this stuff won't load anymore. We're gonna create and load our own page instead of this. But I need a third command prompt to do this. Because this one is locked running my Angular server. This one is locked running my Node server. So I need a new command prompt inside of the client folder, so we can run some Angular commands. Run a new command prompt. No, it doesn't. It needs its own server. Yes, it needs to be. All the TypeScript needs to be compiled. Using NodeMon, it only compiles the Node and Express code. So I'm going to go right into my client folder. So new command prompt, go to wherever your project is, and then inside of client. If I do a directory, I should see all of the Angular stuff. We don't see the Node, any of the Node or Express files, because they're up one level in server and in the root. So the command we want is right here in their little screenshot of a terminal window. ng generate. They've also shortened this. You can just type G instead of generate now. So we can do ng generate or ng G component, and we'll call it task. The components are typically lowercase and singular, is kind of the convention. So I'll just follow that. Ng generate component task. So it created, inside of app, it created a task subfolder with 4 files. An HTML page, our spec.ts, which we're not really interested in, our component.ts, so that's where we're actually going to write the code for our component, style sheet if we want it. It also added a link in our main app.module. And things refresh, our Angular app looks the same. So we've created this empty component, basically, that has a matching HTML and CSS file. So if I go back to my code editor, you can see under app, it's now created a task subfolder. And in here, I've got the CSS, the HTML, and the TypeScript files. It also said it modified app.module.ts. So it imported, when we did that generate component, it imported our component here. So we don't have to use the command line interface. We could manually create all these files, but the ng component does some of the work for us. There's not much in these files, but at least they're here. So now we want to replace, we don't want to see this stuff anymore. On our index.html, instead of loading the app component that Angular gives us, we now want to load the task component. So here's what it looks like. So this is boilerplate for any component. It references the Angular core. It has a selector that defaults to app dash whatever the name is, which we can change. And it sets up the HTML template as well as a style sheet. It has a constructor and it has an Angular initialize method if we want code to run on startup, which we will. We'll want to go and fetch the list of tasks anytime this component is called. So in the HTML, it just gives us one line. We're going to write all our HTML here. So all our form and display of all the tasks, it'll all happen here. So what I'm going to do is inside my index.html, which is here in the root of app, I want to replace my app root tag. I don't want to show the Angular component. I want to show our new task component here. So let's change that tag and save index.html. So just change the word root to the word task. Now when you come here, notice it's wiped out. It's not loading the app root anymore, but it didn't load our page. Our app task is supposed to say task works, but it ain't working. There's a reason for this. We need to go back to our app module. So when we did the ng, we ran the command ng generate component, it imported our component. The issue is here, this Bootstrap. Bootstrap means what's the startup component? It still points to the old one. So if we replace on line 18, we want our task component to get auto-loaded instead. So if I save this on app.module.ts, now our task component with its HTML page is here. So you haven't really written any code where this is just the setup. It is a different font. Well, there's no style sheet, right? Because remember, it wasn't using a global, the components aren't using a global style sheet. It doesn't have anything. We could add Bootstrap. In fact, we want to add Bootstrap. This Bootstrap is not CSS Bootstrap. That's Bootstrap as in initialize. Yes. So if we add code to our task.component.html, like we want to call it COMP2068G. We can take out the paragraph. Right? We'll put on a heading. So if we modify that HTML file and we go back to the browser, it's automatically changed. But we have no CSS. So we definitely want to add Bootstrap. We've already got Bootstrap in our other project, and we've got some JavaScript for a delete confirmation. So if we look in the root, We have a public folder. Just kind of close up everything for a minute. So here are our root folders. Express generates this public folder with images, JavaScripts, and style sheets. We don't really want it in the root, we want it inside the client. So I'm going to move this folder, and then I'm going to copy the JavaScript, going to copy those subfolders. Or actually, we could even just probably delete this. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to copy. So from my original task manager inside of public, we already have images, which we don't really need, but we have JavaScript, which we do need because we put in jQuery and our own script. And we have, under style sheets, we've got Bootstrap. So what I want to do is copy this whole public folder into my, I want to think whether we want it inside of client or inside of client and app. I think we want it right in here. So inside of client source. It doesn't, I don't think it really matters. Let me just check where I want to put it. I'm not entirely sure. Give me a minute to think. I'm certainly going to copy it. I just want to figure out where I want to put it. Bear with me for a second. Where do we want to put the CSS? Okay, so I'm going to copy this folder. And then I'm going to go to my mean SPA, go into client, and I'm going to put it inside of source because we have things like assets here. So I'm going to paste it here. And then I'm going to link to it in index.html. So if we make other components, I mean, this is a single page app, we could link to it right here. But we'll put it right in the heading of index.html. So if we go into app, where is it? In public. So this should give it Bootstrap. If we copy that public folder inside of client SRC. I'm very happy with that. That's interesting. It is here. But our CSS isn't showing up, is it? Okay. Bear with me for just a sec. I want to check where I put it previously. Okay, there is already, maybe we want to put it here. There's already an assets folder that Angular gives us. So I think I'm going to move, I'll get rid of public and I'll move my images, JavaScripts, and style sheets. I'm going to move each one of these into assets since we've already got that folder. So that'll probably change our path a little bit. Yep, so we have images, JavaScripts, and style sheets. Yeah, let's try them there. I'll get rid of my public. We'll try again. Okay, there. It's happier with that path. We could probably also blow away the public folder. Oh, didn't mean to close my app. I don't think we need our root public folder anymore. So yeah, just the public folder that the Express generator created, we can get rid of it. That shouldn't affect anything in our app. So in our component, we have this style URL. We can keep it or we can leave it. We're not going to use that style sheet. We're just using Bootstrap. We don't need a custom CSS for this page. Doesn't matter. So you can leave it or you can remove it. It's irrelevant. The title gets rendered in our browser tab here. So we can change that. We want to update that. That should update our browser tab. Which of course it didn't. Oh, why didn't it? Because it's hard coded here. I'll actually update it in the index file. This is okay, because everything's going to happen in this one page. So we're working on these. We've created these. We've got our component created. We've got our view created. It's not going to be able to show anything yet because we're going to need to do a little more configuration in the component. And then most of the work actually happens in the service because this is the bridge, right? It lets that component talk to our API. So we're going to build our service in a minute. So we're going to go back. We'll need our open command window here. So we use this to generate our component. First, we're going to make a services directory. So we'll store the services separate from the rest of the app to do an mkdir services. And that should be inside of client. So we'll have an empty folder here, and then we can use the Angular CLI to generate this service for us. So it's ng, you can use g or generate, and we want to generate a service called, gotta think what we want to call it. We want to call it task service. I just want to think about the casing for a minute. What do I want to call it? Okay. So we'll do ng, g for generate service, and we'll just call it task. So it's going to create, oh, I did this in the wrong place. Sorry, I want it to go inside my services directory. I'm going to delete those files. So we'll cd services first. So it created our inside of app, it created task service. I'm going to get rid of these two files. So task service.spec. I wanted to create them instead in this. I wanted to create them in the services folder. So I'm going to get rid of those. I'll regenerate them. So we want to be inside of services. And we'll run that again. So we'll generate a task service. So now we've got these files inside of and I want to move, of course, I put it in the wrong place. I'm going to move it inside my source and app. There, third time's a charm. So inside of source app, I said I couldn't move it, and that was because I had the command window open inside the folder. I had to get out of the folder in order to be able to move it. If you've got the command window open there, you can't modify you can't move anything or delete it. So just do a cd ... to traverse up one level in the directory, and you're good. Sorry, I know I confused you. I think I did it 3 times before I got it right. I've lost a lot of blood this morning. So here's what our service looks like. So this is injectable. We talked about dependency injection in .NET last Friday afternoon. Dependency injection, if you were not getting all practical exams, this would be the first question on both your exams. What's dependency injection? Explain it to me so that our visitors in the room could understand what dependency injection is. I'm sure Courtney knows. It says our service is injectable. Right. So it's injectable. So this service can be provided as a dependency to something else. And that something else is going to be our component. Because our component file that we've built, right? Remember, there's a layer in between. Here's the component. The component doesn't access the API directly. The component accesses the API through the service. So the component, the service has to be injected into the component in order for the component to be able to hit our back end. So that's what this injectable decorator is for. Angular puts it in here automatically. So we need a few other things in our service. If we want to make HTTP calls, we need a couple of references. We need the HTTP client, and we need HTTP headers. So that's so we can issue GET POST requests on our API. We need the headers because that allows us to format the content of our requests and responses, and we're just going to set that as equal to JSON. So our service knows any requests it makes are using JSON. We're also going to need this funky module called observable. Anybody heard this term before? Any idea what observable is? Yes, heard it? Has anybody worked with an observable object before? Yeah, absolutely. Take a shot at it.
Well, I mean, I've definitely seen the term community engine before, but I couldn't tell you exactly what it is. I'm assuming it's an object that can be used in some form.
Yeah, you're getting warm. That's not a complete answer, but that's what you've said is all true, Giffen. Anybody else have any thoughts about what an observable is? Think about what this object needs to do. What's the purpose of it? Where does it sit in our stack? It's kind of the heart of everything, really, in bridging the whole app, putting all the pieces of the app together so they can communicate. Right, okay, so from the perspective of talking to the back end, what is the service going to do? What do we need the service to do? Right, so we need to make calls to this Express API that we built, right? So it's got to go to the API and make requests. What happens after it makes a request? What's it going to do? Right. So it's going to make a request to the API, and it's going to wait for a response. And then it's going to take that response, format it, and hand it off to the front end through the component in the HTML. That's exactly what it is. So the idea of this observable class is it's basically used for an asynchronous call, that we can make a request and we can wait for a response. It's kind of like a stream, an open stream, where we're waiting. So for example, if that request fails, the observable can automatically retry the request. And it can wait until we get a response. And when we get a response, we can do something else. In this case, as Tolu said, send it to the Angular component towards the front end. It's sort of like an asynchronous event handler. Yeah, that's one way of thinking about it. Yeah, so I put a link up here where we can maybe look at this a bit more. Yes, hang on, let's look at this link. Angular used to use a different object called a promise, which you might still see. So promises were introduced with Angular 2. And then with Angular 4, they've moved to observables. And there's a kind of a useful discussion here. I'm not going to read through all of it, but there's a few useful things in here that may help guide what we're doing. If it ever loads. We'll go here. I think in here, there's some good discussion about promises and observables, some disagreement about what they are, but there's a good visual. So a promise has a single pipeline, and we can only use it for an asynchronous call. Part of the other thing about a promise is we can't cancel it. Once you initialize it, it's got to wait for some kind of response. An observable, we can cancel and we can retry. We can also stream data over multiple pipelines. If I can't think of a good example of when we'd want to do that exactly. And yes, Peter, you said, is it like an event handler? So we can create it in basically the same manner. So here would be the differences visually. So a promise is pretty simple. Make an asynchronous call, and then we call then, right? That's basically what we're doing when we connect to the database in app.js. So it's using this promise structure. Try to connect to the database using a promise, and then we do one of two things, right? We say it works and we do what we want, or we catch an error. So this is using a promise structure. We can use promises in Angular, but they've kind of been deprecated since Angular 2, which is I think 2 years old now, 2017. So observables, it's more fully featured. We can handle events, we can retry. And if we get data back, we're then going to call this subscribe method. That basically lets us parse whatever data comes back, whatever is in the request. We can filter it, we can do whatever. So we're going to use an observable in our service, which is why we need this class. And it comes with a default constructor method. We're going to use dependency injection here. So in our constructor, we want to inject the HTTP client. So it's not HTTP aware by default. It doesn't know that this is a web-based app. So we can't just start calling get and post. That's why we've got to use this HTTP client. So in our constructor, we're going to use dependency injection. You can't use this service without HTTP. So an instance of HTTP has to come along with it, because the service is no good if it can't make HTTP calls. That's the whole point of it. So we've talked about injectable, we've talked about observable, we've talked about HTTP client. But one other reference here, and then we'll take a break, is the HTTP headers. We're going to use that so we can specify that the content type of all requests and responses here is JSON. It's not HTML. So we'll just set the default content type as JSON. So we can then just attach this object on every request. On the get all, the get one, the post, all those requests, we're going to attach this object. Yep. Well, remember our API, all it returns is JSON, right? So the service calls the API. So by adding this, if we don't add this, by default it's going to just make requests and expect responses and requests in HTTP. Right. Our API only accepts and sends JSON. So when we make a call to any method here, when our service calls it, we're going to add this as an option when we call get or post. by the way, content type is JSON. So then our service will have JSON, and the service will take this JSON and hand it to our component. We haven't written anything here, and then the component will talk to our HTML page. So we got 6 layers. So we've built the layers, but our service is only partly built, our component is empty, and we'll have a little more configuration to do as well to get it all to work. I think in the time we have left today, we're going to take a break here. We should be able to actually get the list of tasks to display. I think that's reasonable for us to do. Okay, so I will stop the stream. I'll push to get, I'm going to grab a coffee. We'll come back in about 10. Do you guys need anything else? Sure.